If the Eldar are 40K's version of the dead civilization, its surviving remnants scrabbling amidst the ruins of all they've lost, and the Imperium is the example of the decaying empire, slowly but surely plodding towards its own destruction, then the Tau Empire is the young, new empire on the rise, full of energy and dynamism, ready to stand tall on the galactic stage. But the Tau are also as much oddball as they are underdog. In a universe that's mostly science fantasy, what with demons, psychic powers, and melee combat, the Tau are effectively the most science fiction-y of the various factions. And in a universe where everybody hates everybody else and wants to wipe them out, the Tau come offering a different philosophy, one of tolerance and inclusion, so long as you're willing to play by their rules. They have no confirmed psychic talent and are physically weaker than baseline humans, yet they make up for this with technologies unmatched by any save the Necrons and perhaps the Eldar. Some call them the good guys of the grimdark future, or at least the closest thing to it, while others dismiss them as weeaboo space communists. In the end, only one thing is certain. With the Tau, as with Transformers, there is always more than meets the eye. The Tau were first introduced to Warhammer 40,000 in the 3rd edition in 1998, when Games Workshop announced their intent that these guys were intended to be the unqualified good guys of a universe defined by necessary evil and moral ambiguity. The fan reaction went something like this. Then, when said fans actually read the codexes and the bits of lore fluff within, declaring the Tau to be a relatively peaceful, utopian society where its citizens worked without complaint or coercion in the name of the greater good, the reaction became something like this.
Ready?
Ready!
Those were nowhere near properly digested.
Unsurprisingly, Games Workshop made some necessary adjustments. They made the Tau less squeaky clean and unambiguously good, and more in keeping with the grim, dark, morally ambiguous tone of the 40K universe, creating the current incarnation of the Tau that fans have known ever since. That's the real-world history of the Tau within the context of the game. But what about their in-universe history? The story of the Tau began in the year 789 Millennia 35, in the far eastern fringes of the galaxy, or as the Imperium called it, Ultima Segmentum. One of the explorator vessels, the Land's Vision, picked up signs of life on a small planet known to its natives as Ta'au. The planet itself was arid and poor in resources, but somehow had managed to produce not only life, but sentient life. The native sapients were a relatively humanoid species with bluish skin, hoof-like toes, and a strange slit in the middle of their faces. They were also exceedingly primitive, having only recently figured out fire and the wheel. Unsurprisingly, being the xenophobic and genocidal civilization that it is, the Adeptus Mechanicus resolved to inform the Imperium as soon as possible of this new Xenos race so that the proper authorities could go out there and exterminate them. Before they could do this, however, the Ta'au system was suddenly engulfed in a warp storm, rendering travel through the system impossible and effectively cutting off the planet and its inhabitants from the rest of the galaxy. Warp storms are a very random phenomenon, unsurprising given that they are, after all, the product of chaos. When a planet is engulfed by a warp storm, sometimes they are subjected to large-scale demonic invasions or widespread bouts of random mutation. Sometimes, though, the warp storm engulfs the world and nothing happens. This seems to have been the case with the Tau and their homeworld, at least as far as we know. The warp storm lasted for roughly between 1,000 and 2,000 years. Not that the Tau noticed. For them, life simply carried on as normal. They eventually went from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and even to gunpowder. Because Ta'au was an arid planet with very little natural resources, life was always a struggle, and often the Tau had to fight one another simply to survive. However, as their various societies became more advanced and their populations presumably increased, the fighting became more and more vicious, until the planet was engulfed in a state of near constant warfare, a period that the Tau themselves refer to as the Mon Tau, or Age of Death. There are no precise dates as to when this period began or how long it lasted. All we know for sure is how it ended. The city of Phao Taun had been under siege for 5 years by an army of tribes from the nearby plains. For 5 years, its citizenry had endured all the privations that siege warfare entails: confinement, lack of food, disease, and low morale. The situation was little better in the camps of the besiegers. For 5 monotonous years they had turned their guns upon the city's walls, and yet there seemed to be no progress. They were no closer to completing the siege than they were at the beginning. Then, according to legend, a pair of strangers appeared. One walked among the camps of the besieging army. The other somehow gained entry to the city. Calling themselves the Aun, or Ethereals, the 2 strangers walked among their respective audiences, speaking to them of the ideas of unity and friendship, that the Tau were stronger together than against each other. They spoke of a philosophy that they called the greater good, and the purpose of the Tau was to spread that idea and to bring unity to their people and to all the peoples of the universe that may or may not be. They also said that the Tau could achieve this by putting aside their selfish desires and to think of themselves in terms of a greater whole, a nobler, grander purpose. Such was the wisdom of the 2 Ethereals, and so profound seemed the wisdom of their philosophy and their words, that the very next day, the leaders of the besieged city and the besieging army met outside the gates of Phao Taun to make peace. Across the world, other Ethereals approached the other tribes of the Tau, each preaching the same message, the same philosophy of unity and combined purpose. And thus, within a short time, though again an unspecified amount of time, the Tau Empire was born. Given their singular role in the forging of this union, the Ethereals were acclaimed by all to be the spiritual and political leaders of all Tau. Their authority is absolute and unquestioned, to the point where even today, thousands of years later, an Ethereal can order a Tau of another caste to kill himself, and that Tau will do so without hesitation. To even question the authority of an Ethereal is at best a grievous insult in Tau society. Perhaps the most famous and noteworthy decision of the Ethereals was that once their technology had become advanced enough, they chose to impose a strict, regimented breeding program upon the rest of the Tau population. Tau of a certain type were only permitted to mate and have children with Tau of similar type, in order to produce offspring that would exhibit the virtues and qualities that the Ethereals believed would best further and serve the greater good. Thus, in modern 40k, the most noteworthy aspect of the Tau is its caste system. At the very top, of course, are the Aun, the aforementioned Ethereals, each one raised from birth to rule. Even the lowliest Ethereal is at least on par with a planetary governor of the Imperium. And at the very top is the Ethereal Council, the ruling body of the Empire, and its leader, the Ethereal Supreme. Ever since the Imperium's first encounter with the Tau, the Inquisition has had a particular interest in the Tau Ethereals, and how they are able to maintain such perfect control over their society. This is hardly surprising, given how many times the Imperium has to put down secessionists, traitors, and uprisings. Of course, the Tau themselves aver that the Ethereals rule through sublime wisdom and profound vision, but this is the grim darkness of the far future we're talking about. It can't be that simple or positive. Or at least, that's how the Inquisition sees it. Possible theories as to how the Ethereals maintain their absolute, unquestioned control have ranged from pheromones to the idea of the Ethereals as a secret class of psychers. Of course, none of these theories have been confirmed so far, but the agents of the Inquisition, particularly the Ordo Xenos, are nothing if not persistent. Then there is the Shas, or Fire Caste. Bred to be stronger and more resilient than the others, they serve as the military arm of the Tau, and are thus the most commonly encountered by other factions in this galaxy of endless war. Next is Por, the water caste, the merchants, diplomats, and ambassadors of the Empire, those charged with promulgating the greater good to any new races they encounter. Next, the Core, the air caste, bred for the single purpose of piloting starships, both the commercial vessels of the Tau merchant fleet and the military vessels of the Korvatra, the Tau Empire's spaceborne navy. The breeding program has left these tall and thin. The Tau have yet to master artificial gravity technology. As a result, members of the air caste have been specially bred to operate in low gravity or even zero gravity environments, resulting in low body mass and hollow bones. This means that air caste members rarely, if ever, set foot on a planet. They are practically born, live, and die in space. Finally, there is Phio, the Earth caste, the majority of the Tau population, charged with all of the tasks that aren't specifically covered by the other 4 castes. They are farmers and laborers, but also scientists, engineers, and technicians. To the higher ranks of the Earth caste falls the duty of developing, designing, manufacturing, and maintaining the technologies that allow the Tau Empire to defend itself and spread its dominion. Each of the castes is divided into 6 ranks, starting at the very bottom with Sal, the trainee rank, and then working its way from lowest to highest, La, Oui, Vre, El, and O. The way that Tau naming conventions work is that a Tau will introduce himself or herself by stating his or her caste and rank within that caste, followed by the name of the sept or star system of the Empire that they were born in. Tau are not given names at birth. Names are something that they acquire later in life, and the name usually signifies a particular character trait or skill, or some great deed that they have accomplished. For example, there is a Tau whose full name reads as Shas O Vyorla Shova Kais Montir. So, Shas O means that he is fire caste and of the highest rank. Vyorla is the name of the sept that he was born in. Shova is his personal name, meaning far-sighted. Kais means skilled, which is pretty self-explanatory, while Montir literally translates as blooded, indicating that he is a seasoned veteran. As you may have noticed, though, such a name is a literal mouthful. And so, for the sake of brevity, this character would most likely be referred to simply as Oshova, or Commander Farsight. As soon as the Tau Empire figured out interstellar travel, they decided to expand beyond their own native system and spread the greater good to all the races of the galaxy. Known as the Spheres of Expansion, these enabled the Tau Empire to increase its dominion and brought the Tau themselves into contact with other species. And, unlike the human supremacist ethos of the Imperium of Man, the Tau found that the greater good was all-encompassing enough to include all these new aliens and guarantee them a place and a purpose within the Tau Empire. And if one of those new races said, thanks, but no thanks, we have no quarrel with you, but we're not interested in joining, well, that's where the darker side of the Tau begins to show itself. As a people, the Tau are possessed of an intense moral self-righteousness. They are utterly convinced that the greater good is a truth so unequivocal that if necessary, it must be imposed by force upon those who simply don't know what's good for them. Consent is not an issue for them. All will serve the greater good, one way or another. Which of course brings us to the subject of the Tau's technology. Unlike the Adeptus Mechanicus, who believe that all knowledge and technology already exists and simply needs to be recovered from the past, therefore there is no need to experiment and discover anything new, the Tau approach to technology is the exact opposite. Imperial and Mechanicus forces that have encountered the Tau are often so baffled by their technology that they often refer to it as techno-sorcery. For example, infrared vision or heat vision is fairly commonplace today, and in the Tau Empire, it is so commonplace that every Tau Fire Warrior's helmet contains infrared sensors. By contrast, the Imperium has forgotten infrared technology. They don't even know what it is, and so the average guardsman usually has to settle for taping a flashlight to the barrel of his las gun in any situation that isn't broad daylight. As another example, take anti-gravity. Unlike the Tau, the Imperium actually has artificial gravity down pat. But while they are aware of artificial gravity, the adepts of Mars haven't quite managed to master it just yet. So the technology is often rare. By contrast, the Tau have mastered anti-gravity to the point where, much like the Eldar and the Necron, most if not all of their vehicles are anti-grav vehicles, including tanks and troop carriers. Though perhaps the most noteworthy example in terms of weapons technology is plasma weaponry. Now, plasma weapons do exist in the Imperium, but Imperial plasma weapons are generally rare and hard to make. They are also infamous for being highly unstable and more often than not overloading and blowing up in the faces of the wielder. By contrast, Tau plasma weapons, or pulse weapons as they call them, are not only far more efficient and safer, but they are so commonplace that not just the Tau soldiery, but even the allied race auxiliaries are armed with pulse rifles. Perhaps the most significant way in which Tau technology departs from not just the Imperium, but the rest of the species in the galaxy is their use of artificial intelligence. Where the Imperium and the Mechanicus decry the abominable intelligence as a form of technological heresy, the Tau use AI extensively, though primarily and most familiarly in the form of drones. Granted, even the most advanced military drone is only on par with a dog in terms of intelligence, it does possess a degree of self-awareness and learning ability. It will flee when it perceives mortal danger, unlike, say, a war robot of the Legio Cybernetica. A group of drones can increase their intelligence by networking, essentially combining their processing ability to improve their intelligence and awareness. This allows drones to, horror upon horrors, act independently of any controller for at least a limited period of time. They are primarily used in a military capacity as support for Tau fire warriors, but drones can also be used for a myriad of civilian tasks, such as delivering messages or moving objects with anti-grav generators. That's not to say that the Tau have the Imperium beat on all fields of technology. There's the aforementioned artificial gravity. There's also the fact that since the Tau have no equivalent to the navigators, their space vessels, while capable of warp travel, can only do so for the briefest periods of time, meaning essentially that Tau fleets move much slower than any other faction in the galaxy. There's also the fact that the Tau have no equivalent to a Titan. Every other faction in 40k has a giant mech the size of a skyscraper. The Eldar have Wraithbone constructs, the Orcs have Gargants, even the Tyranids have bioforms that are comparable in size to a Titan. But not the Tau. The closest thing they have to that is also the most famous aspect of their arsenal, the battlesuit, and even then it's only slightly bigger than a Space Marine dreadnought. Even the smallest Imperial Knight has a Tau battlesuit outgunned in terms of size, although the battlesuits make up for this slightly by being faster and more maneuverable. These comparative disparities in their armed forces also affects the way the Tau wage war. As a general rule, the forces of the Tau Empire prefer to fight at long range, avoiding close-quarters combat whenever possible. This, of course, has led to one of the oldest jokes in the 40k fandom, that the Tau can't do melee. In fairness, it's not that hard to see why. On average, Tau firearms are far superior to their Imperial equivalents, and it makes sense for the Tau to play to their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. Even the physically strongest Tau fire warrior is barely on par with that of a baseline human. A single assault marine armed with a chainsword, provided he could get close enough, could tear through an entire battalion of fire warriors like a bandsaw through blueberry jelly. The Tau Empire discovered this to their great cost during their third sphere of expansion, when they finally began encroaching upon worlds of the Imperium of Man. Many outlying human worlds found the ideology of the greater good appealing, but the Imperium takes a very dim view of people who wish to secede from its rule, particularly when those people wish to secede only to be ruled over by a bunch of filthy Xenos. And so, in the year 742 M41, the Imperium launched what it called the Damocles Gulf Crusade. And while the Tau had fought and bested Orcs and Tyranids, those forces had been relatively small. For the first time, the Tau had come up against a civilization that was not only far more ruthless and vicious than themselves, but also many, many times larger. The whole of the Tau Empire is barely the size of an imperial sector. The Imperium of Man, meanwhile, for all of its stagnation and numerous enemies, spans the entirety of the galaxy. Hundreds of thousands of planets, home to many hundreds of trillions of human beings, ready to be conscripted into her armies to fight in the name of the God Emperor. And for all its many moral failings, the Imperium is hardly the worst faction in the galaxy. The Tau have only just recently discovered what chaos is. In fact, they didn't even know it existed, or at least most of the populace didn't know. It has been heavily suspected by some, including the infamous Commander Farsight, that the Tau Ethereals had already known about chaos prior to the Tau Empire's first encounters with them, but had kept the knowledge deliberately suppressed, causing the commander in question to suffer a crisis of faith. Commander Farsight's story will have to wait for a video of his own, however. Suffice it to say, the Tau have yet to discover an effective method of countering the agents of the ruinous gods. The Tau themselves have no natural psychers, a pretty serious liability given that psychic powers are one of the most effective counters to the denizens of the warp. On the plus side, at least, this means that the Tau Empire doesn't have to worry about random citizens going insane and setting things on fire, or opening up portals and letting through hordes of demons onto their worlds. And so, that is where we find the Tau at the dawn of the 42nd millennium. A young, up-and-coming empire discovering that the galaxy is a lot bigger and a lot nastier than their worst imaginings, but still determined to press on for the greater good. There really is only one final issue to cover in this video. Why are the Tau called space communists? One look at the caste system will tell you that this isn't really in line with Marxist philosophy. Whether you like Marx, hate Marx, or like me, really, really hate Marx, it's hard to deny that the man was no fan of classes or class distinctions. Even the most basic appraisal makes it pretty clear that, if anything, the Tau Empire is more in line with Plato's Republic. This is reinforced by the fact that, in the lore, the Ethereals are often referred to as philosopher kings, the type of people that Plato believed ought to rule in his perfect society. So why weeaboo space communists? I think this is partly a combination of the context in which the Tau were first introduced to 40K and the ideology behind the greater good itself. Context first. The third edition of 40K is released in 1995. It's a little over half a decade since the implosion of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The vast majority of surviving socialist countries, mostly in Latin America or Africa, have by this point degenerated into tin-horn dictatorships, of no real threat or concern to the Western world. The only socialist country that poses a potential threat is China. The mid-90s are also around the same time where Japanese animation has begun to grow a significant fan base outside of its native country. This is pretty plain to see in the fact that the aesthetic of the Tau, particularly the battlesuits, evokes Japanese mecha anime like Gundam, Patlabor, or Macross. That at least explains the weeaboo part, anyway. Then there is the ideology of the greater good, the notion that an individual means less than the collective, and that the individual only has value in what he or she can do for the collective. Whereas someone of a more individualist leaning might say, this here is Harry and he happens to be a working class man. Someone of Marxian bent might say, this is a working class man named Harry. The identity of what group you belong to ultimately matters more than who you are as a distinct individual person. Now, communism isn't the only ideology that has favored the group over the individual, but both historically and today, it is one of the most significant and one of the most recognizable. There is also a matter of similar attitudes. Like the Tau, Marxists, both historically and today, are possessed of a sense of utter moral self-righteousness. They are so convinced of the purity and rightness of their cause that those who disagree with them must, in their minds, be morally wrong, not just intellectually wrong. And so, albeit in a simplistic manner, the pieces fall into place. It's the mid-90s, Games Workshop introduces a new alien race that has a clear Oriental sci-fi inspired aesthetic and is built around a morally puritanical collectivist ideology, hence weeaboo space communists. A relatively straightforward answer to a relatively straightforward question. But now, in modern 40K, with the formation of the Great Rift and chaos running rampant more so than ever before, in addition to the increase of Tyranid Hive Fleet incursions, the return of the Silent King, and a new alliance between the Eldar and the Imperium, can the Tau continue to survive in this grimdark universe? Unfortunately, that is a question that can only be answered in the fullness of time and the whim of Games Workshop. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.